Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing my highs and lows from the first quarter of 2022. So I'm going to give you some stats at the start, and then I'm going to tell you the books I really loved from this quarter, the books that were disappointments from this quarter as well. So let's jump straight in with some quick statistics. So throughout January, February and March, I read a total of 23 books. 4 of these were sci-fi books, 1 of these was a horror, and then the other 18 were fantasy books, which is pretty standard reading for me. A little less sci-fi than sometimes, but yeah, pretty standard set of genres for me. My average rating in these months was exceedingly high. It was over 4.5 star rating. Now that sounds ridiculous, and that is ridiculous compared to my usual average. Now, if we take out one author from this, so there's one author that in these 3 months I read 8 books from, and that's Jim Butcher. I read 8 books from Jim Butcher, all of which I gave 5 stars. If we take Jim Butcher out of the equation and we take an average from those other 15 books that I read, my average is at 3.9. Now that is much more usual, if anything, a little bit low for me, but it tells you there that how much of an impact Jim Butcher has had on my average rating in these 3 months. 3.9 is a little bit low as an average rating, but if I'm going to take out 8 of my favourite books, the rating's going to be a little bit lower. But yeah, that's my average for these months with the books that I have read. So there are my quick stats, and then from here I'm going to talk about my highs and my lows. So let's start with the books that were disappointments for me initially. The first of these is going to be The Emperor's Blades by Brian Staveley. This was something I started as part of a read-along with the Library of Alexandria, and all in all, it was a bit of a disappointment. Now, I didn't hate this book as much as some of the other people in the read-along. I think it had a poor start, and that was the issue, really. I didn't love the character work. I didn't love the setup of their plots. I think the world was really interesting, but I don't think that it was followed through particularly well early on in their character arcs. Now, we follow 3 main characters in The Emperor's Blades. I say 3, really it's 2. It's 2. And one that we get a very small little bit of, which I hear we get more of in later books, but yeah, I was a little bit disappointed how little we got of this 3rd character. But these are all children of the Emperor, who we find out early on has been killed. And we are basically seeing their reactions. They are spread out across the empire, and we are seeing their reactions to this, or what they are doing before they hear about this as well. And it was okay. I wasn't in love with it at the start. I think it had a very solid ending, which bumped it up to sort of a 2.5 star read for me. It could have been a 3-star read, but the beginning was just such a drag that it just held it back, unfortunately. I probably will continue on with this series at some point. I really do think and do hope that it improves, because the end of book 1 was so much better than the beginning. I'm hoping that continues throughout the trilogy, but it's not exactly a high priority for me anytime soon. The other book that I'm going to have here in my lows, in my disappointments, is a book by R.A. Salvatore. It is book 2 of the Icewind Dale trilogy, and it's Streams of Silver. Now, I actually like this book a lot more than The Crystal Shard, which is the first book in the Icewind Dale trilogy. So you might think, well, why is this a disappointment then? Why is this on the lows? And the reason is that I really loved the Dark Elf trilogy, which was the trilogy that comes before this chronologically. I think it was written exceedingly well. I gave most of the books in it 4 stars. They were really good reads, a really good introduction to Drizzt, our Dark Elf hero. And therefore, I was really disappointed at the end of last year when I read The Crystal Shard, and it basically put a kibosh on me wanting to continue this series. It put a massive pause on the series. I hadn't read anything from it in a little while, and I decided to pick up Streams of Silver. I've heard it's a little bit better. And it definitely was a little bit better, and I did enjoy it. I gave it 3 stars. I'm definitely more willing to continue with this series now. I am hoping that the Halfling's Gem, book 3 of the Icewind Dale trilogy, will continue to improve, and it will get better and better. But I am a little bit disappointed that this is not on the same level of the Dark Elf trilogy, which I had read initially and I really enjoyed. So that's the main reason this is a disappointment. Not because the book is terrible, just because I was so hopeful for this series. And I know it's a long-running series. I know there's like 20-odd books, 25 books in this series or something, if you take all the different series together and go through them chronologically. And therefore I was hoping for a better second trilogy to really push me on into the rest of this series. And it's been fine. It was fine. It was a D&D fantasy adventure, and it was fine, but it was not as gripping, it was not as enjoyable as I was hoping that it would be. So there are my lows. There are my books that I was disappointed with. And it tells you something that there's only really 2 of them. And it tells you how good a quarter this has been for my reading. You can see with a 4.5-star average throughout the quarter, I really had a good reading quarter. I loved a lot of the books that I read, and that is awesome. So let's get to some of the standout highs from this quarter. And I'm going to start with the aforementioned author, Jim Butcher. As I said, I've read 8 books from Jim Butcher in this quarter. 4 of them were the Dresden Files books that I'm rereading at the minute and is my favourite series, so of course they're getting really high ratings. 4 of them were books 2 to books 5 in the Codex Alera series, which I am loving almost as much as I love Dresden. Every book here has been a 5-star read again. I think it is building and building and building to a wonderful, wonderful level. I have just started book 6, the finale of the Codex Alera series, and I'm really hyped to get into it and see how it goes. Let's move on from Jim Butcher because I've talked a lot about him in the last few weeks on my channel. So let's move on to some other positives from this quarter. The next author I want to talk about is Joe Abercrombie. I have been planning to read Joe Abercrombie for many, many months, and it just never quite happened. And I decided that in January we were going to start. We were going to do The Blade Itself, and we're going to read 1 book in the First Law trilogy each month for this first quarter. And I absolutely adore the First Law trilogy. It is very different to the type of fantasy that I normally love. I normally like the heroic, the upbeat, positive fantasy series. I'm not a massive grimdark fantasy fan, but the way Joe Abercrombie writes is just brilliant. His prose is awesome. I love the characters we get to know, and they're not great people. They're pretty grim and terrible people, but I love the way they're written. I think they're super understandable. I can understand their motivations. I don't necessarily get when people say that it's so realistic, because I think most people in our world aren't quite as inherently and intentionally evil as some of the guys we get in the First Law trilogy. But I do think that some of the characters are super realistic. I absolutely adore some of the characters that I'd not heard talked about before. I'd always heard people talk about Glockter, and people talk about Logan, and they're the people I'd heard mentioned over and over and over again with the character work of Joe Abercrombie. For me, I love Luther. I think he's amazing. I love Colin West. Amazing. Yeah, there are so many characters in this series that I just absolutely love. And yeah, Glockter and Logan are great, but I was surprised by how much I loved the whole range of characters that we get in the First Law trilogy. So there's a massive positive for me. That's slotted into my top 10 fantasy series if you go and have a look at that video. Yeah, really, really enjoyed the First Law trilogy. So those were the authors whom I had absolutely glowing reviews for throughout this first quarter of 2022. And next up, I want to talk about a little bit of a surprise. And now this is a book that I thought I would like, but I didn't realise I would love it quite as much as I did. And this is Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a novella. It's very short. It's 144 pages, I think is what it was. I read it on my Kindle and I thought I'd like it. I like Tchaikovsky. I've read some of his novellas before. They've generally been in the 3.5 to 4.5 star range, depending on which ones they were. And I think he writes novellas very well. I was not prepared, however, for how much I was going to love Ogres. I think it is very well written. It does a great job of telling its story in an interesting and in a clever way. I love the use of second-person perspective, which I did not imagine I would. I think second-person perspective can be very hit or miss, and I think Tchaikovsky uses it very, very well and to great effect in this novella. And for a quick read, for a short novella, I absolutely loved it. It told a really full story in an incredibly well-imagined way, and I was impressed that it told the story in exactly the length of pages it needed. It didn't feel condensed, it didn't feel chopped down, it still felt like a real, solid, well-worked fantasy sci-fi story, but it was done in such an amazing way that I cannot rate this book highly enough. If you like a novella, if you want a novella to slot in between these chunky epics we often read, I would absolutely recommend Ogres as the best Tchaikovsky novella I have read. And as many of you know, I'm not always a big novella fan. I often feel like people need more page time to really build characters and stories, but here I did not feel that at all. Love this from Tchaikovsky, an absolute banger. So there you go, the lows, the highs, and a nice surprise from my first quarter reading in 2022. Let me know down below, what were your disappointments? What were your absolute favourites that you read in this first quarter as well? And there should be a video up here for you to go and check out some of my other content. Hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.